In the spring of 1985, the people of a quiet town in British Columbia would be shaken by a mystery that would haunt them for over a decade. A brilliant young biologist vanished deep in the province's remote wilderness without leaving a single trace. Despite exhaustive searches, no one could explain how a woman so experienced in the forest could simply disappear. But 11 years later, a commercial airline pilot spotted something in the trees, something so strange and impossible that it would force the case wide open. What he saw would reveal the terrifying truth about what really happened to her. On March 15, 1985, the thick evergreen forests of northern British Columbia stood silent under a cold, pale sky. Dr. Emily Carter, a 34-year-old botanist specializing in medicinal plants, arrived at the small field research camp near the Skeena River. She had been working with the University of British Columbia on a study documenting rare plant species used by indigenous communities for centuries. Emily was no stranger to the rugged Canadian wilderness. At 165 meters tall, with chestnut hair always tied back and sharp green eyes that seemed to notice every detail, she had spent her life in the field, often trekking alone into the most isolated valleys and ridges. That Friday morning, she told her research assistant she planned to explore a small tributary known as Wolf Creek, following a tip from a Gixon elder about a plant with unusual healing properties. "It only grows in one clearing far from any trail," the elder had said, "and it only shows itself to those who walk alone and in silence." Emily smiled, not one to be spooked by legends. She packed her rucksack with field notebooks, sample bags, food for 2 days, a compass, and her well-worn survival kit. Before leaving, she told her assistant, "If I'm not back by sunset, don't worry. But if you don't see me by tomorrow noon, send a search party." At 8:30 a.m., several people from camp watched her step onto the narrow path into the forest, her dark green backpack bouncing lightly with each stride. The last person to see her alive was an experienced trapper named Jack Thompson. He met her near a fork in the trail at 9:15. "You're headed that way?" he asked, pointing toward Wolf Creek. "Yes," she replied, "looking for something rare." Jack hesitated. "Be careful, Doc. People say that place isn't right." Emily just laughed softly and kept walking. That was the last time anyone saw her. When Emily didn't return to camp that evening, her assistant, Mark Harris, remembered her words and tried to stay calm. He prepared dinner, glancing toward the trail every few minutes, half expecting her to emerge from the shadows of the trees. But by the next morning, anxiety gnawed at him. At noon sharp, he gathered 5 people from camp, 2 graduate students, a guide, and 2 local volunteers, and set out toward Wolf Creek. They followed the path Emily had taken, moving quickly through the damp forest floor where moss muffled their footsteps. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth confirmed they were on her trail. For about 2 kilometers beyond the fork, the tracks were clear, until they weren't. Suddenly, the ground ahead showed no sign of human passage, as if she had simply stepped out of existence. By late afternoon, the search team returned empty-handed. Mark radioed the nearest RCMP detachment. Within hours, officers, search and rescue teams, and volunteers arrived. Over the next 3 days, the area was combed by more than 30 people, with dogs and even a helicopter scanning from above. On the 4th day, a breakthrough, or so they thought. In a small clearing deep beyond Wolf Creek, searchers found broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, and what looked like a dark stain on the soil. Nearby, Emily's compass was embedded in a cedar trunk, as if thrown with force. 50 meters away lay her waterproof field notebook, its pages warped from rain. The last entry described a plant with heart-shaped leaves, reddish stems, and a sweet scent. The Gixan called it tears of the forest, believed to have pain-relieving properties. The RCMP considered 3 main possibilities. The first was a wildlife encounter. Northern British Columbia is home to black bears, grizzlies, wolves, and even large moose, any of which can be dangerous under certain conditions. A wildlife biologist on the search team noted that while fatal encounters were rare, they weren't impossible, especially if Emily had startled an animal with young. Still, the absence of any tracks or carcass signs made this theory less convincing. The second possibility was foul play. The surrounding valleys and logging roads had occasional reports of illegal activities, unauthorized logging, poaching, and even small-scale drug operations. If Emily had stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to see, someone might have wanted her gone. The compass lodged in the tree, and the stain in the clearing fed this suspicion. The third theory was that Emily had simply become lost and succumbed to the elements. But those who knew her scoffed at the idea. She had spent years navigating wild terrain and spoke both English and Gitxsan fluently. She could survive in the forest for days with minimal gear. Local indigenous elders were also consulted. An elder named Thomas Greywolf said something that stayed with investigators. "The forest has rules. She went where she was not meant to go. Some places are not for outsiders." His tone wasn't accusatory. It was almost protective, as if he believed Emily had crossed into sacred territory. Despite weeks of searching, on foot, by air, and even using sonar in nearby rivers, no further trace of Emily was found. The forest had swallowed her whole. News of Emily's disappearance spread quickly through the Skeena Valley and beyond. By the second week, it had reached national headlines across Canada. Helicopters from the RCMP air services and the Canadian forces were deployed to scour the region from above. Volunteer pilots with small bush planes joined the search, flying low over ridges and lakes, scanning for any sign, a piece of clothing, a fire pit, or movement among the trees. On the ground, SAR teams extended their search radius to over 20 kilometers from the original clearing. They used tracking dogs, drones, and even thermal imaging equipment. Old logging roads and abandoned cabins were checked one by one. Every lead brought a rush of hope, but each ended in disappointment. Local trappers and hunters combed less-traveled trails, calling her name. Indigenous searchers moved quietly through the forest, looking for subtle signs, broken branches, disturbed moss, that others might miss. But as weeks turned into months, the official search was scaled back. RCMP Sergeant Daniel Fraser held a press conference, his voice heavy. "At this stage, we have no evidence of foul play, but we also have no evidence that Emily simply walked away. The file remains open." For her parents, Linda and Robert McAllister, time seemed to stop. They kept Emily's cabin exactly as she had left it, her notebook stacked neatly on the desk, her boots by the door, a half-finished jar of blueberry jam on the counter. Unanswered questions gnawed at everyone who had known her. How could a woman so skilled in the wilderness vanish without leaving even a scrap of evidence? And if she had met with an accident, why was there no trace? By the late 1990s, Emily's case had faded from the headlines, but it never faded from the minds of those who lived in the Skeena Valley. Hunters still swapped stories by campfire light, about strange noises in the forest, about fleeting glimpses of a figure moving through the trees where no one should have been. One spring, a hiker reported finding a scrap of fabric snagged high in a cedar branch deep in the backcountry, about 12 kilometers from the original search area. The RCMP sent it for analysis. Weeks later, the results came back. The fabric was wool, consistent with the sweater Emily had been wearing the day she vanished, but there was no way to prove it was hers. Other rumors were harder to dismiss. A trapper claimed he'd seen smoke from a small fire in a valley long abandoned by loggers. But when a search team went in, there was no sign of a camp, only ashes scattered in the wind. Emily's mother, Linda, refused to give up. She joined online forums for missing persons, wrote letters to investigative journalists, and even consulted with search and rescue veterans in Alaska, hoping fresh eyes might spot what the original search had missed. In the autumn of 2000, a hunter stumbled upon something unusual near an overgrown trail, 3 small piles of smooth white stones arranged in a pattern. He thought nothing of it at the time, assuming it was the work of children or hikers. But years later, that detail would take on a chilling new significance. It was August 23rd, 2000, more than 11 years since Emily Harper vanished without a trace. Captain David Reynolds, a seasoned commercial pilot for Northern Pacific Airways, was flying a routine afternoon route from Prince George to Vancouver. The sky was clear, the sun slanting gold over endless ridges of forest. At 2:14 p.m., as they crossed a remote stretch of the Skeena River Valley, something caught his eye far below, an unnatural brightness in the deep green canopy. At first, he thought it was just sunlight hitting a rock slide, but the shape was too precise, too deliberate. "Mark, are you seeing this?" he asked his co-pilot, tilting the nose slightly for a better angle. Through binoculars, David's breath caught. There, in the middle of a small clearing, was a massive message spelled out in white stones, each letter at least 40 feet tall. "Help, Emily Harper alive." The stones were arranged with a precision that made it impossible to mistake as random. Beside the message, faint smoke curled from what looked like the remains of a small fire. David's pulse quickened. He immediately radioed air traffic control. "This is Northern Pacific 218. I've spotted what appears to be a distress signal in the forest. Coordinates incoming. This is urgent. Possible missing person." Within hours, helicopters from the RCMP and Search and Rescue were en route. By late afternoon, boots were on the ground at the coordinates David had provided. What they found would stun even the most hardened officers. By 5:22 p.m., the thudding blades of the RCMP helicopter sent leaves spinning through the air as it descended toward the tiny clearing. The rescue team leapt out, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. They spotted her almost instantly. Emily Harper was sitting at the base of a massive cedar tree, her legs drawn up, a length of heavy chain locked around her ankle. She was shockingly thin, her face hollow, her once brown hair streaked entirely with gray. Her eyes, wide and wet, blinked rapidly against the sudden flood of light and noise. "Emily?" Sergeant Carter called softly, approaching with hands raised. She nodded, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "You found me." Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. The team moved quickly. Bolt cutters severed the rusted chain. Medics wrapped her in a thermal blanket, and someone handed her a water bottle, which she clutched with trembling hands. The makeshift camp around her was a haunting testament to her captivity. A crude log cabin with a dirt floor, a fire pit surrounded by blackened pots, and against one wall a table stacked with neatly bound notebooks, her research painstakingly documented over the years. But there was something else, a trail of footprints leading away from the camp, fresh, heading deeper into the forest. Whoever had kept her here had fled, probably only hours before the rescue arrived. Emily looked toward that trail, her voice shaking. He's still out there. At the detachment in Prince George 2 days later, Emily sat across from Inspector Malone, a blanket still draped around her shoulders. Her voice was steadier now, but her eyes carried a weight that could not be measured. "It wasn't a stranger," she began. "It was someone I knew, someone I trusted." She told them about Dr. Richard Vaughn, a fellow researcher she'd met at environmental conferences years earlier. He'd shown interest in her work, cataloging rare plant species in British Columbia's interior. At first, she thought it was professional admiration, until his questions became more personal and his presence more frequent. On the day she vanished, she had been heading toward a grove she had never studied before. That was when Richard appeared on the trail, armed, his expression cold and fixed. "You're coming with me," he'd said. He marched her miles off the path to a site he had been preparing for months, an isolated prison where he could force her to share every discovery she had ever made. But Richard hadn't acted alone. Emily's breath caught when she revealed the second name, Thomas Greer, a local bush guide known for helping researchers navigate difficult terrain. He had been the one to point her toward the shorter route that day, a route that led straight into Richard's hands. Over the years, the two men had forced Emily to document and process plants with possible pharmaceutical value, smuggling the information to overseas buyers. She was allowed just enough food to keep working, and punished when she refused. When Malone asked why they hadn't killed her, Emily's answer was chilling. Because dead people can't finish research. The footprints found near the clearing matched recent shoe impressions from Thomas Greer. He was still out there, armed, dangerous, and now desperate. The manhunt had just begun. The trial of Dr. Richard Vasquez began in March 1997 at the Supreme Court of British Columbia. The case drew national attention, with journalists from across the country covering every detail. Richard was charged with aggravated kidnapping, unlawful confinement, torture, and conspiracy. The Crown sought the maximum penalty, arguing that his crimes were calculated, cruel, and spanned more than a decade. When Marina Thompson took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her voice was fragile, but her words cut through the air like a blade. She described the 11 years of captivity as a never-ending nightmare. Richard had forced her to work up to 12 hours a day, cataloging plants and preparing extracts, all under the threat of starvation or dehydration whenever she resisted. He said, "I was helping advance science," Marina testified, "but I knew he was stealing sacred knowledge from indigenous communities to sell to foreign corporations." The defense, led by attorney Mark Holloway, claimed Richard suffered from severe mental disorders, including obsessive-compulsive behavior and narcissistic personality traits, allegedly impairing his judgment. They presented psychiatric reports in an attempt to humanize him. But Crown Prosecutor Daniel Harper countered decisively. This was no accident. Richard Vasquez spent months planning this crime. He built a prison in the wilderness, recruited accomplices, and ran an illegal operation for over a decade. That is premeditation and full mental capacity. Evidence revealed during the trial shocked the public. Richard had made an estimated $25 million selling Marina's stolen research to pharmaceutical companies in the United States and Europe. Bank records traced the money to offshore accounts. The revelation ignited outrage across Canada, especially among environmentalists and Indigenous leaders. After 3 intense weeks, the jury, 7 citizens who had listened to every harrowing detail, deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. As the words were read aloud, Marina closed her eyes, a single tear tracing down her weathered cheek. She wasn't celebrating. Justice, though delivered, could never erase the scars. Richard showed no emotion as the judge scheduled sentencing for the following month. The court adjourned, but the weight of what had been uncovered lingered like a shadow over everyone present. 1 month later, on April 22, 1997, the Supreme Court reconvened for sentencing. The courtroom was tense, filled with journalists, environmental activists, and members of indigenous communities who had followed the case from the beginning. Judge Eleanor Brooks, known for her firm but measured rulings, addressed Richard Vasquez directly. "You deprived a woman of her freedom for over a decade. You exploited her knowledge for profit, stripped her dignity, and subjected her to unimaginable cruelty. This court finds no justification, no excuse, and no redemption for your actions." She then delivered the sentence, 28 years in a maximum security prison with no possibility of parole for 20 years. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in applause at the news. Marina Thompson, now a free woman but forever changed, stood silently beside her lawyer. Her frail hands trembled as she spoke to the press. "Justice was served today," she said, her voice steady. "But I will never get those 11 years back. My only wish now is that no other researcher, no other person, will suffer what I went through." The years that followed were bittersweet. Marina received medical treatment and psychological care, but the trauma left deep scars. She could no longer work in the forest she once loved. The mere sound of rustling leaves could send her into panic. She lived quietly in a small home near Victoria, cared for by friends and occasional visits from colleagues who still called her a pioneer. Her story became a rallying cry for better protections for scientists and environmental defenders, inspiring new laws in British Columbia and across Canada. Richard Vasquez spent the rest of his life behind bars, dying of cancer in 2010 without ever expressing remorse. One of his accomplices had died years earlier. The other was never found, disappearing without a trace. The research stolen from Marina was never fully recovered, and priceless knowledge of medicinal plants was likely lost forever. Yet, despite the loss, Marina's courage in painstakingly building that massive stone message, letter by letter, day after day, had broken through the isolation of the wilderness and brought her home. It was a testament to the unbreakable human will to survive. Today, decades later, her name is remembered not just as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience, defiance, and the power of hope.